optional. Okay, terrific. We are online, live streaming on YouTube. And so let me, I just want to introduce you first, and we're still waiting. Okay. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Today we're having a conversation with Dr. John Beebe, and I'm going to be a little distracted as I admit people here. Dr. Beebe is a psychiatrist who specializes in psychotherapy and is an analyst member of the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco. He founded the Institute's quarterly publication, now titled Jung Journal, Culture and Psyche, and was the first U.S. co-editor of the London-based Journal of Analytical Psychology. He is the author of Integrity in Depth and of Energies and Patterns in Psychological Type, the Reservoir of Consciousness. He is co-author of the Psychiatric Treatment, Crisis Clinic and Consultation, and the Presence of the Feminine in Film. He is editor of Terror, Violence, and the Impulse to Destroy, and C.G. Jung's Aspects of the Masculine, and co-editor of The Question of Psychological Types, the Correspondence of C.G. Jung and Hans Schmidt-Geusen, 1915-1916. And so thank you very much for being here, John. I appreciate it very much. And this accomplishes one of my purposes, which is to try to break out of the sort of Jungian silo and see if we can't get better understanding among all human beings around the world. And so go ahead.
I'm enjoying the Jungian silo. I get this sudden image of that Grant Wood picture with the man and the woman and the pitchfork. And I think sometimes that's people's first image of Jungian analysis. You got the masculine and the feminine, and I don't know what the pitchfork is, but you better integrate your shadow or else.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you a little something. This can be sort of an open analysis of me, if you like, but last week, there was a discussion on Shrikant's meetup, which I think you were involved in. It was not you who was the prime speaker, and while you folks were speaking, I was running a stream of chat comments to Shrikant about what was being said there, which I'll acknowledge to you because they represent something in my shadow, I suppose, and you picked up on it because you heard my question that I put to the group, and I told Shrikant that I did not want to come on to a discussion of this because I wanted to remain respectful. And so I just asked the question, and the reason I was concerned was I thought that the presentation was fairly facile, and this was not your presentation, I must emphasize, but it wasn't addressing the process and how psychological types are actually used both in the US military, where I first encountered it, and in business in general. So I thought maybe I would, as a warm up here, just give you a quick précis on what I was responding to. So I served in the Marine Corps to Lieutenant Colonel, about 20 years in reserve and 3 years during Vietnam time on active duty. And because of my reserve duty, I was invited to 4 senior schools of the U.S. military, which are the National War College, the Naval War College, the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and Command and Staff College. And in addition to that, I attended the Center for Creative Leadership in Greensboro, North Carolina. And as you probably know, one of their programs is mandatory for all selected brigadier generals. Once someone is a colonel in the Army and is selected for brigadier general, they must attend this session at the Center for Creative Leadership before they get frocked, before they can wear their stars. And so at all 5 of those places that I went to, the Myers-Briggs type indicator was taught. Now I understand that, that is an offshoot from Jungian psychology per se, but nonetheless it contains major elements of it. And so ever since then, so starting in 1987, I've been using the Myers-Briggs type indicator for my own purposes, and which included time in the Marine Corps, but it also included developing a major business, which ultimately had 6,000 employees in the Republic of India and 40 production centers in India. And ultimately in 2005, it went public. And so I come from some experience about these things. And, what I've found is that the psychological types book seems to me to be an early part of Dr. Jung's development. I really, in my own trying to read it and see what he's saying, I find myself getting lost in the weeds. And in the military, what we were taught to do, so from a process point of view, was that anytime we have a mission, okay, there's a fundamental idea in the military, which is called the 5-paragraph order. And every leader in the U.S. Marine Corps, at least, all the way from Lance Corporal Private First Class to 4-star General, knows how to give a 5-paragraph order. And the 5 elements of it are situation, mission, execution, administration, and command and control, which is mainly about communications. And so in the mission part of the 5-paragraph order, it's necessary to deal with issues that come up in the personality types. And so the first thing that must be accomplished, and they teach us to do this with a Z, which the Z goes from sensing to intuitive to thinking to feeling. And sorry, I just have to admit another person here. And so the implications of that are that first of all, we have to get all the details of the situation, and that comes from the sensing type. Then we have to understand the overall meaning of it. thirdly, we have to think about how we're going to execute the plan, which is the thinking part. And the feeling aspect has to do with how, if we execute the plan either successfully or unsuccessfully, how that's going to impact the work. And so, so what we were taught to do in all these schools was to make sure that we always had on our leadership teams people from all psychological type, from all these psychological types, so that we would have somebody who is very good at getting all the details, someone who has an overview, someone who can think it through, and someone who can see what the implications of it are in the future. And let's see. And so what I've talked about sensing and intuitive, and I each time I've been tested on the MBTI, I've gone off the charts on the intuitive end. I've been in the 99th percentile on the intuitive end since I first took it in 1987. And what I know about myself from lots and lots of experience is that I'm literally blind to what people can't get. And so what I see in that methodology that the military uses is that I must have very good sensors around me. And I describe sensing and intuitive in this way. A sensing person, you can show them 1,000 trees and they won't believe there's a forest. An intuitive person, you can show them 3 trees and they'll assume there's a forest.
That's kind of neat. Yeah, that's great. That's not bad.
and that's how it works for me.
It only takes 1 tree for me. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but obviously, as leader, it's very hard to, if you're highly intuitive, it's very hard to get enough details so that you can you can do something, you can execute a mission. And as it happens, in the statistics that they describe to us is that 95% of all generals and admirals, meaning 2 stars and below, in my view, because this is my observation, 95% of all generals and admirals are STJ, okay, sensing, thinking, and judgmental. But the exceptions, and I can describe this a bit, the exceptions are people like Colin Powell, James Mattis, John Kelly. Those are very good examples of the intuitive type in the US military general corps who get above the 2-star. And I explain this by saying, most Marines that ever came to me for guidance said, just tell me what you want me to do, sir. Just, give me the mission and tell me what you want to happen and I'll go do it. But I do not want to be involved in the politics. Okay, they always say that I do not want to be involved in the politics because, being sensing, they kind of don't appreciate the politics. And so the people that rise to 3 and 4 stars tend to be people who have been involved in the politics and can handle that. So I've said a lot of things here. I wonder if you want to comment.
Well, we all meet people where they are, and thank you for letting me know where you are. Let me just say 2 things that might interest you in no particular order, but they matter. First of all, I'm an Army child. My father was a battalion commander in Korea for the U.S. Army.
Mhm.
He was lieutenant colonel at that time, and so I knew that. Now, my parents were divorced when I was 9, but my father was nevertheless an impressive presence in my life, although very often not around, as often happens. And then when he returned to the scene, he did something that has actually been written about in military magazines. Having made all the arrangements that a son does who has only a mother and no brothers or sisters and no uncles or anybody around immediately, made his own adjustments and found his own way of doing things. Father, who had never been around to show him how to do those things, would come back and immediately criticize all the arrangements that had been made. And it wasn't until an article appeared in a military magazine that my father and his third wife read that they finally realized what I'd been up against all through my childhood and adolescence. So that we're even talking in this civil way is a tribute to Jungian analysis. So my father often went on the attack, and I must tell you that you also started with an attack on someone that I rather like named John Roth, who gave the presentation that you took exception to. And I had actually suggested him to speak to Shrikant's meetup group, because he also, like yourself, cares deeply about the application of these ideas. And of course, the US Army is so interesting. The US Army has gotten so interested in typology, and I can certainly see why. That's due largely to a man named Otto Krager, who pushed psychological types with a wonderful zeal in Washington, D.C., and got all people training in it. And I think it's wonderful that the Army, which I have a lot of respect for, actually, perhaps as much as any time in my life this past week, when certain Army officers have said things that are very dear to my heart. And because I think the integrity and the willingness to, as you picked up when I talked, to verify and work out clear decision plans and base things on evidence and evidence-based planning and team building, wonderful. And the type work works beautifully there, especially in the area of introverted sensation and verification, and also staying on message and on mission. All that's really great. John Roth, who was speaking, comes from corporate life in America primarily. I gather you had the Army base and then went into corporate life. For many people in corporate life, the hole in the moral ozone is such a horrendous experience. I have so many people who have gone to business school with an ethical attitude and finally had to give up all kinds of for-profit business for nonprofit because they could not find any ethics in business. And I have friends who've gone through this experience where people in a company where all the salespeople were actually falsifying certain records so that it would look as if people were buying in another state so that they themselves could pocket the tax involved and not tell the company about it, and were fired. And then when the sales went back, the same people started to be rehired because they were the only people that sold well enough were the people who were willing to lie to the customers and so forth. So when you've been coming through corporate America and tried to deal with this Byzantine thing, the ethical problem comes up, and then you have this passion to redesign things. And out of that comes design thinking in the hopes that it's going to do something that will find its way into things like not just the bottom line of profit, but the eternal problem of value. Unfortunately, when people talk about design thinking, they don't talk about why they think design thinking is needed. And they're not really addressing their true topic, which is this terrible problem of management in which especially the feeling function gets left out, particularly in its introverted aspect. we nowadays have a kind of emotionally intelligent, extroverted feeling in corporations. So everyone manages feeling at that level of affirmation of others. But when it actually comes down to standing for something with integrity and value, so there we get the odd thing is that about types, which is that we all have a problem with feeling, because in the feeling function is so strongly in each of us, either introverted or extroverted. And it gets into a very odd sense wherever we have our introverted feeling in our whole typology, which archetypal energy is associated with it, we get amazingly and quickly energized by the idea that the other person talking to us isn't speaking with integrity. Mm-hmm. And so when my book Integrity in Depth was published, it was the journal edited by the rather interesting Jungian analyst James Hillman. I don't know who wrote it, but said, this is a book about the virtue everyone believes no one else has. And I thought that was the best thing ever said about it. So let me just say that the Army solved certain kinds of problems exquisitely. And the design researchers are trying less exquisitely, perhaps letting their intuition run a bit to try to get hold of a whole new vision of what corporate life could really look like. And so the application of psychological types to the workplace in which so many people have to work and live, the corporate world, is very popular too, as with the US Army, but also still elusive. And I think we're going to find the answer, not as we might think in the intuition sensation problem, but in the feeling area and how the feeling. So I think with each presentation, we have to ask the person, what's your passion? Why are we looking to Jung's theories to solve certain emotional problems? Aren't we going round Robin's Hood barn to have to go to the collective unconscious to figure out how to get along with my wife, that kind of thing. But somehow, if you take the feeling function as the place where we all divide, at least at first, then I think there's the chance for it to enable us to come together. So I'm always the kind of person, child of divorced parents with a very combative military father, looking for ways to unite and bring together. And so I'm always looking for what in the typology is causing us to be divided, and how can I speak to and bridge that divide. I don't always find it, but it's where I'm looking. It's where my search is.
Well, I do have a comment on the business side that might be useful to you, because I did take a Chicago School MBA, not from Chicago, but from the Simon School at the University of Rochester. And the way I describe that MBA, which I got in 1979, is 15 courses in statistics by different names. And
that's a laugh from someone who's always found statistics an extraordinarily irritating subject. Yes.
Well, and of course, Dr. Jung did too. But basically, it ran ethics out of the business world, because when I was in business school, at that time, there was a clear separation of three interest groups. which were the management, the employees, and the shareholders. But because of the implementation of Milton Friedman's Chicago School, the statistics approach, that now for at least two generations of MBAs, has been written out of the system. And so the result is that one of my friends said it's a psychotic way of teaching business training, because they basically ran any sort of human factors out of MBA training. And so now everybody's trained to solve for the bottom line and solve what's best for them without thinking about other interest groups. And
could I say something quickly?
Surely, Nancy, go ahead.
I just wanted to say to you, Dr. Beebe.
Oh, hi, Nancy. I don't see you, but hello.
Thank you. I'm recovering from some eye surgery, so I'm hiding.
Because I'm looking at an eye patch. How wonderful. That's great. It's okay. You can hide, but I see Nancy Pfaff, and that's lovely to see your name.
Thank you. Well, I am a spiritual director, and I have various people come to just share their lives, and that we can get in touch with what invitation God is giving them. And one person came who was a manager in a global company who had just been to a big training session for their leaders. And they put it quite plainly: if you wanted to make X number of millions or billions of dollars, you could not care for the people. And that just broke my heart to hear that, but that's what you're saying.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what we've been trained to do.
Well, except that I think they're wrong. I think we could run the world in such a way that everyone profited, and that has always been my belief. And every time I've tried to do it in any organization of which I'm a part, I've always had a measure of success simply on the basis of that belief and my willingness to do everything I can, and that's a lot, that has to be done in a very specific way to make that happen. And it's always amazing, the result. And I've had it repeatedly in the course of my life when I've had the chance to do the little I can do in the few organizations I've had enough power in to do something. It always saddens me to think that people do not see that what benefits the needs of the whole benefits every individual within that whole. That's integrity in a nutshell.
Right.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I want to say something. It's quite shocking me this couple of days, because I was watching the 13th, and also I was reading this book on it's a Fandigo diet about healthy food, holistic food, and because I suspect my kids may have ADHD, but what I learned is quite shocking. It's like all the food diet actually is made from petroleum, and they quit all these ADHD kids. And also, it was banned in Europe, where you have to have the label. In American, you don't have to do anything. It wasn't passed FDA. There was a proposal to do it. So it realized this whole extreme capitalist is really not hurting Black people, systematically discrimination, hurting everybody. It's like they take advantage. They just have this short-term gain for their money. They don't think about any benefit of humanity. It's crazy how many ADHD kids we have right now. And it's all created by all this artificial coloring, reservative, and all this flavor, all this made from chemicals. Very bad for human body. It's very shocking to me.
I'm very moved in a variety of ways by what you said, and I would like to generalize it to well, I can't stop thinking a Christian thought, but when it could be just as easily a Confucian thought, and in many ways it was originally a Jewish thought. But Jesus, who was Jewish, is supposed to have said, if you do it unto the least of these my brethren, you do it unto me. And so the least of these my brethren in this country are the children. And the fact that so many children in this America, this prosperous America, live in poverty, so that just this last closing of schools where people had to stay at home meant all over America that many, many children no longer had their only sure meal of the day, which was the school lunch. And when I think of the quality of the food that poor children eat when they are able to eat food, it just breaks my heart that even that one meal of the day would be compromised at the get-go, whether at school or at home, by the things you're talking about. It's pretty horrible. It's pretty horrible. And if we don't start with that as our top concern, it's very hard to believe that anyone could grow up right and trust with that kind of trust that caretaking is a value. And when that happens, it's not surprising that a large number of people are not particularly interested in taking care of others. And so the culture's sociopathy is creating the individual sociopathy. And I think you've just put your finger right on where the problem is, and therefore the magnitude of what's going to need to happen if we're going to make a change. And yet I feel this is a time when people are exploring change. And it doesn't seem to me a bridge too far to start looking. That would be a very specific introverted sensation fact and an extroverted sensation set of variables that could be actually looked at. So that would require both sharing the wealth and verifying that the wealth was being shared not only equitably but intelligently. And so you'd have to have both extroverted sensation and introverted sensation as a pair of opposites working with each other to see if we could bring up children who felt viscerally better and therefore were more willing to put their shoulders too to the wheel as they become adults to make the whole thing work. Imagine that kind of thinking operating at the level of public policy. Just imagine what that would look like.
I want to go back to the MBTI just a moment because it relates to marriage. And one of the things that I learned in my own study of the MBTI, which has been fairly extensive, although not so much in psychological types, relates to the judging perceiving spectrum, which I don't think Dr. Jung expanded on as much as the others. But one of the things that I was taught was that you're better off in your marriage if you find a spouse who has at least one thing the same to you as you, but not everything the same. So you need one or two things at least the same. And so if everything's different, if you're on opposite sides on everything, there's too much conflict. And if you're on the same side of everything, it's too boring. and it happens that with my wife and I, fortunately, we have only one difference. I'm INTP and she's INTJ. And so the way I describe these in a very pithy way is the J person goes to the grocery store with a list and pulls things off the shelves from their list. The P person goes up and down the aisles of the grocery store and pulls things off the shelves. Both eat. And so what I say is the perceiving guy is the one that buys the ice cream. The judging person is the one that makes sure we have good nutrition. And because both my wife and I have been working with Myers-Briggs for more than 30 years, we recognize when this difference, this JP difference, emerges in our relationship, and so we can deal with it in a jocular fashion, like, oh, that's very J of you, or that's very P of you. But it occurred to me, and I now have a second marriage that's 35 years long. I had a first marriage that was 17 years long, and it occurred to me that my first marriage would not have ended if I had been better educated on psychology, including the thoughts of transformation through life, psychological transformation through life through the various archetypal layers, and also this MBTI issue. So I'm sure you deal with a lot of marriage situations. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, there's no question that psychological types becomes a reality in marriage situations. I mean, that's where the type differences really come. And so many, many people who otherwise don't pay much attention to Jungian thought apply type theory to marital couples. And certainly I've done a great deal of couple therapy in my practice as a psychiatrist. And I find it constantly important to get hold of the practical type differences. The JP dimension is usually where people stumble when they try to use the MBTI. And there's an interesting history to how that JP came into being that many people don't know. I had a long conversation about this with Mary McCauley about 30 years ago, who was a remarkable human being. She sort of took over after Isabel Briggs Myers died and really had as much to do as anyone with the burgeoning popularity of the MBTI. A lot of people resent the JP dimension, and even these days are wishing it had never come into being. What happened is that Isabel Briggs Myers and her mother found a sentence in Jung that they build the Taj Mahal around, actually, but in many ways, I think very valuably. Jung is trying to talk about the difference between the dominant function of consciousness and what he called the auxiliary function. In the book, Psychological Types, he does a number of extraordinary things, as you know, but he introduces two ideas which each of which has taken me half a lifetime to unpack the meaning of. And one is the idea of an auxiliary function, which he took originally from a man named Otto Gross. And the other is the idea of the inferior function, which is an idea that you can trace all the way back to the German playwright and friend of Goethe, Friedrich Schiller. And so what Jung did with these two ideas, an auxiliary function and an inferior function, was quite extraordinary. And he recognized that these were two ways in which there's an alternative to the dominant function, which Jung had already concluded by the time he published Psychological Types, was actually an evil in the midst of the Western project of the Enlightenment, and is responsible as anything for one of the most unnecessary and awful wars in human history, World War I, which he himself, through his own dreams and upset at that time, not unlike some of the upsets some of us have around collective events today, had concluded was there because we were oversold on the whole idea of domination. And therefore, the myth of the hero, the heroic individual, which had been such an important part of the Renaissance and so much symbolized by a sculpture like Michelangelo's David, the idea of the human rising to being able to define and with his own identity and his own vision experience. And when that became nations vying for top dog, as when the cousins, all relatives of Queen Victoria, had their decision that they had to have, one of them had the best seaport or the best war, and we got into that German, Russian, English interest that helped to shape the attitude toward that produced World War I, where everybody's vying for domination and capacity. Jung was trying to look beyond the hero in himself. And that's what his dream of slaying Siegfried, the Germanic hero, was all about. Siegfried was the heroic son of Sigmund. Now, of course, at that time, Jung had his own Sigmund to deal with, Sigmund Freud, and that slaying of Siegfried was a slaying for as much as he knew how to do of his own heroic aspiration. He was, after all, made to be the crown prince of Freud. He could have stayed in the psychoanalytic movement. He was the president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. When he decided the hero was the problem, he not only resigned from the presidency of the International Psychoanalytic Association, he was its first president, but also he resigned his professorship at the University of Zurich. So he did everything he could to deconstruct the hero in himself. And in the process, he was developing the theory of psychological types, which he had the book written in 1919. So between 1913 and 1919, he expanded a very simplistic model of type, which is just extrovert, introvert, into something much more complicated, because in the original one, the extroverts were the same as the feeling types, and the introverts were the same as the thinking types, and there it stopped. So when he got to psychological types, he introduced a lot of other things than just a heroic dominant function. He introduced an auxiliary function. He introduced an inferior function. Now, what the sentence that Isabel Briggs-Myers and her mother found in psychological types was, the auxiliary function is different in every respect from the dominant function. Now, they took that seriously. In fact, more seriously than I think I'm afraid to say, Jung took it himself when he wrote it. When he wrote it, he meant one thing. He meant that if the dominant function happens to be what he called a rational function, the auxiliary function will be an irrational function, and vice versa. Now there he was operating on a level that very few people to this day have been able to follow him. That consciousness itself, not the unconscious, but consciousness itself, can be either rational or irrational. And if it's rational, you have the thinking or the feeling type. If it's irrational, you have the intuitive or the sensation type. And his understanding of feeling as a rational function and sensation as an irrational function are so radical, because most people had seen sensation as rational, and feeling as irrational. The romantics love to talk about feeling as if it were irrational, and the logical positivists love to talk about sensation as if it were rational. Jung is pairing with dominant and auxiliary one rational and one irrational function. So you get a remarkable pair of opposites if you can even understand the difference between rational and irrational consciousness. When Isabel Briggs Myers and her mother took that sentence from Jung, they did one thing Jung should have done and would have made all the difference if he had done it. And it's the first thing I picked up when I began to write my additions and extensions of Jung's typology, that if the dominant function is extroverted, the auxiliary is introverted. And if the dominant function is introverted, the auxiliary is extroverted. So they took both respects in which the dominant and the auxiliary are different. They did that brilliantly. Jung only took it one way, which is the rational irrational. Trying to make this work in a paper and pencil test, and this is what Mary Macaulay explained to me, is that when you have a paper and pencil test in which people are answering questions, you've got to look at what people do in the outer world. So your perfect example of going to the grocery store, and do you either go with a shopping list or do you just pull things off the shelf? Is exactly the kind of behavior that they felt they could measure on a paper and pencil test. So they assigned the J and the P to the leading extroverted function because in their view, the extroverted function is what you use to go to the store, and it's just a question of how you use it. So, and that you can measure in a paper and pencil test. So it gets very difficult because they're using J and P not to always refer to the auxiliary function, because if in an extrovert, it will refer to the dominant function. And in an introvert, it will refer to the auxiliary because it's always the extroverted function they're measuring. Moreover, they were unwilling to take the term rational and irrational seriously because irrational sounded crazy to them. And they didn't want to lay that on people. So they would refer to it, but they would use words like non-rational and things like that. So what I've tried to do to sort out this massive confusion, we had this conversation, I said, the perfect storm becomes when you get to the introverted feeling type. That's a rational type. But because it's introverted, it's always going to have a P assigned to it because it's going to, its auxiliary function will be a P function, either sensation or intuition. But anyone who's ever known an introverted feeling type well knows how they always start with judgment. They always start with this feels wrong to me or that feels wrong. It starts with judging. So the minute you call them a P, you've completely missed how their core being involves judging. So as a start, I take all the functions of consciousness in my model through several stages of development. With introverted feeling, you have to start with judging. It then moves into appraising and finally to establishing the value, and always against a background of what feels right from an archetypal introverted perspective. So when you think about it that way, you have to have another term for what, and she said, Macaulay said, we really should revise the manual to make it clear to everyone that although introverted feeling, when dominant, will have a P at the end of whatever it is, like INFP or ISFP, it's still a rational type. She said that sentence should be added, but I don't believe they added it. What I think happened is it just stayed in place, and now it's a course. So many people are abandoning the MBTI right on that issue. What I did was say, let us, in addition to what's going on with the leading extroverted function or with the auxiliary function, to speak of the spine of the personality. And ask yourself, when you are dealing with a person, is their spine rational or irrational, just as Jung told us? Mm-hmm. That, to me, is the heart of type difference. The difference between rational and irrational spines is greater, in my opinion, than the difference between men and women, such that a man who has an irrational spine and a woman who have an irrational spine have more in common than a man who has a rational spine and a man who has an irrational spine. The difference is that great. But we have, so for so many people, the idea that there can even be irrational consciousness is kind of crazy making. There's an assumption that consciousness is rational. So with all of that, you can see that we need a way to see the core of a person and then see what their auxiliary function is doing. And then see how they're using their extroversion and their introversion. All I can tell you is it opens up the MBTI in a very exciting way. It doesn't deny the MBTI, but it shows how the MBTI is actually working for the person, and the yield in terms of greater empathy between people is much greater than when you just cling to the JP dimension and make that the difference. That's surely true for extroverted decisions that a couple needs to make. There's no question about what you're talking about, from taking a trip to raising a child to going to the grocery store to how you handle money, all the things that people argue about. No question about it. And it's essential in couple therapy, but there's so much more than that to whether someone feels truly related to in a marriage. And unless the other grabs hold of the other's core, there's always going to be that terrible loneliness and bitterness that one doesn't, when one feels that one lives with and devotes one's life to someone who doesn't understand them at all. So that's what I really want to do something about. I guess I'm very ambitious.
Well, you raised a number of points that I want to address. And I think that the issue of rational and irrational is a very important one that I'd like to hear your opinion. I've had a insight over the last 3 years as I've been doing this work online, that that the logos as has been presented to us over millennia now is dead. Okay, in other words, and I don't mean dead, it doesn't exist. I mean everything in your room, including the screen you're looking at, is not a living thing. Okay. Yes, I'm physically living, but you're not in the room with me. So from the perspective of anything that you look at in your existing room, yes, everything that we see physically in our world is the product of 100% perfection. Okay. In other words, you wouldn't have bought the whatever you're looking at on the screen, that computer or any of the books in your room or your jacket or your shirt, any of it, all of it has to be the product of logos, which means perfection. Okay, it has to be perfect or you wouldn't have bought it. And that is a kind of...
That's so sad, isn't it, that logos has come to mean perfection.
Right.
Surely that cannot be what John says in the Bible when he says there was the word, the logos, and the logos became flesh. That cannot be what the incarnation was. Yet that's what it's become.
That's what it's become.
And Christy becomes perfectionism, addiction to perfection.
And if you pick up the Bible, that's not what John said.
What did he say?
He said he said that in John 1:1, and
Sure.
that's what all the Protestant pastors I ever heard of
So he
lean
said
on.
it,
but it says John 1:4, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. Okay.
Yes.
They never teach that. Okay.
Yes.
And so my point is that there's nothing alive in the logos. We need logos because we can't think without it. Okay. We need to be able to stand on one another's shoulders. We're all standing on the shoulders of Carl Jung now because he had certain insights from which we can develop further. We can't keep saying that he had everything perfectly. Obviously, he did not. But the point is, the logos gives us the structure, the skeleton on which we live our lives, but it is not life itself. And the real opposite of logos is actually life. And I frequently use an image which I'll share with you here just briefly. Most of my followers know this image quite well, but this is a 64-foot motor yacht, and the name of it is Never Enough. Okay. And the point is, it's not a living thing. It's dead and it's sitting at the dock. Okay. Now, if the owner were in it and out on the Chesapeake Bay, he would be putting life into it. But as I often say about the Bible is just a black doorstop unless you put life into it. And that's what pastors do, of course.
Well, let me come in there for a second, because you've really got something we just can't, because this is about Carl Jung and archetypes. So let me make the jump, and then you'll see where I'm going. Jung really introduces a concept in psychological types, which is the centerpiece of everything in Jungian psychology. And it is the concept of the anima. And the anima is the archetype of life. And yet one of her commonest symbols is the ship on the sea. You remember that ships were often given women's names, and the prow or masthead of the ship would often be a woman's face. And that idea of some vessel that allows one to connect with and move along with the unconscious as ocean, for example. The most powerful image of the anima, probably in American film, is in a movie that Greta Garbo made in 1932. I think that's when she made it anyway. Queen Christina, and it's about the strange queen of Sweden, who was in many ways quite androgynous. She sometimes wore men's clothes, but she eventually abdicated. And in the last scene of Queen Christina, the queen is on a boat sailing somewhere, and the director Ruben Mamoulian directed it by telling Garbo, she said, "What shall I be thinking of?" And he said, "Think of nothing at all." And so you have Garbo standing at the prow of the ship, just looking ahead with that amazing face with no expression on it whatsoever. And it's this phenomenal emptiness of the possibility of whatever life will bring yet. And she becomes the living masthead of the ship. So I never saw such an image of the anima. So the anima starts with a kind of deadness that is potential with life. And I feel like that ship sitting there is just waiting for the animation to turn it into something that would really make it a very life-serving. And isn't that where the ship of state is in this country right now? The ship of state is looking for an anima that will actually care about the integrity of the whole.
Right. Well, as I sometimes say, our president is a poster child for materialism because he's lived his whole life based on achieving certain things, regardless of what it took to get them. And he's gotten to the pinnacle of everything he's done, however he's done that. But is this a happy man? And that's the issue, or is this a whole man?
Well, forgive me.
We don't have to
forgive me for saying too much, but may I just say, as an observer, like all of the rest of you, and all I see is what I see on television. I've never met the person. I certainly have never examined him, and I do not have a diagnosis. I don't approve of that. Mm-hmm. But I can say, when you say, is this a happy man? I would say, surely not. And what I feel has been happening is that if people cannot see the pain and hear the pain in that voice and see the suffering on that face and see that he knows he's a gargoyle. He's not, I mean, that's what he is. He knows he is, and he always has been at some level a misfit. And he's made a joke of it. And he's also made a mess of the rest of us by putting the very same suffering into us. There are people who cannot contain their own pain, and they can only put it into others. And I'm sorry to say, he's one of those people. I have no need to make it. I mean, my God, we all make other people suffer for what we are. So there isn't one of us who isn't guilty of the very same thing. But the degree to which the ugly American makes everything ugly is something that we were worried about back when the term was coined in the 50s. You must remember this, the book, The Ugly American, and so forth. Of course I do. And I don't think we realize how dangerous it is to projectively identify that ugliness in each other. And so we have this tremendous opportunity to decide, are we going to keep on making other people suffer for what's wrong with us? Or are we going to do something about what's wrong with us? And I think the time has come. I'm so excited. I think I've waited for this for 52 years. It's 1968 again, and we're not going to vote for Nixon this time. It's going to be different. It's going to be very different. And I feel that to me means that, and what I mean by voting for Nixon, I mean trying to bring the revolution that needs to happen to a stop. The revolution, the American Revolution, needs to be completed. Jefferson understood that. He actually said we need a revolution every 20 years. Well, we had a revolution going, and we ground it to a halt. And now we have to finish the revolution that went into kind of like the Sleeping Beauty's sleep, and the whole palace went to sleep after the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and especially Martin Luther King. Yeah. And all that's happened since has been zombie-like, and we have zombie films. That's what you're talking about. The life is in the anima, and in the anima can come integrity. And if you complete the American Revolution, we're not going to all end up with wrong politics. We're going to end up with a politics for all, just as we always thought we could. It won't be that hard.
So is part of the problem the hero story itself? In other words, we've been sold, the hero's journey by Joseph Campbell and in film for the last 45, 50 years. And it occurred to me that we need now to understand that the hero's story is something a bit different from what we have been thinking of it in this way. For me, the hero's journey is actually the journey of becoming a mature individual. And that means going from a time when we're born as a wild animal and have to model our parents to learn what we're doing. We're just creatures when we're first born, and in order to learn to be a human being, we have to go through lots of modeling and education with our parents, and then by perhaps our spiritual group or whatever it is, and then obviously education, formal and informal. But when we get, the hero's journey really ends, it's not really a journey for life. It's really only a journey to reach maturity. And if you don't understand that, then you're going to have a midlife crisis, and which is quite common for us in the United States. And so, and it's happened to me. I acknowledge that because every time I did something, whether it was joining the Marines, going to law school, going to business school, building a public company, all those things were kind of heroic journeys. But in some way, every one of them ended in some sort of trauma. Okay. So in the Marine Corps, I broke my leg in uniform. So the last thing I ever did was break my leg in uniform. Okay, so that was my trauma.
Wow.
And
well, but that's the breakdown. That's the midlife breakdown.
Right.
I guess I like the midlife crisis in the sense of the hoary idea, the Chinese idea of the crisis is danger plus opportunity. I like the idea of creative breakdown, where you break down the identification with the dominant function so that the inferior function, which is carried by the anima and the animus, both very important connectors to the self, both are associated with the inferior function. That means what Jung says, it's the difference between the ideal of capacity, which is the dominant function ideal, and the incapacity, which he talks about in the Red Book, which is not the spirit of the times, which is surely in his times this idea of capacity and domination on the basis of capacity. It was the time of logical positivism and competitive hero nations. But he says what happens, and remember, he's writing the Red Book when he's 40 years old, and he was having the midlife crisis of all time, and he knew it, and he knew that he had lost his soul, which he knew was feminine, but he didn't know where to find her. And the first thing that happened when he started doing active imagination was that Elijah, the Old Testament prophet, introduced him to his soul, who turned out to be someone he didn't expect, Salome, the biblical Salome, who'd danced for her stepfather Herod and demanded the head of John the Baptist on a platter as a reward for her great dance. I mean, Jung didn't know what in the world that meant, except that she wasn't going to let him get away with being top dog any longer if she'd done that to John the Baptist. So he was going to. He had a lot to learn from his soul, but what he learned from his soul was to trust his incapacity as much as he had once trusted his capacity. Because Jung was a very capable young man, and he had tremendous achievement in 40 years. I mean, literally, just for example, between not only what he read, but who he met, between the ages of 27 and 37, he met everybody who was anybody in the entire field of depth psychology, and was absolutely at the very top of that profession internationally. He was even more famous when he met Freud than Freud was. Before, and then Freud made him even more so. So it was an amazing capacity. But what he came to in his time of what he thought was a nervous breakdown, when it was really just a breakdown of heroic identification, he got to the values of incapacity. The value of the broken leg is what I talked to you about. The
Sure.
moment when it breaks down can be the beginning. It's a very old idea.
Yeah.
The beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. And fear of the Lord is when you know you can't dominate anymore.
Right. You're not going to be a general. Yeah, I've learned that a few times. Very much so, but we could bring it back to movies rather than making it about me.
Sure, sure. Well, it's about all of us. I mean, I'm no different, as we can tell my
Right.
story of breakdown. I had quite a midlife crisis myself, and it was the making of me.
Yeah, and it's always been the making of me as well, and that's why we're having this conversation today. Okay, and that's why I've spent the last 33 years reading this man's books. Okay, obviously. So I could go through a few
so
more.
Fascinating. He's been your analyst. I mean, that's your analyst is reading Jung, and exactly. That is the way for so many people. Reading Jung is therapeutic.
Yes, exactly. And I never aspired to be a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist, never at all. But I just, for the benefit of laymen who are listening to this, I want to go back for a minute to the movies and to start. Okay.
No quarrel from me. I adore movies.
Right. So in Star Wars Episode 4, which is the first Star Wars film, Luke Skywalker does all these heroic things and goes through the hero's journey, and it ends with him in a huge auditorium with a throng of people present, and he's being awarded a medal, and that's kind of the end of the movie.
With a burst of joy. That first film is, which Lucas himself directed, is the most joyous film, and the way people lined up to see it and kept seeing it again and again. It's that joy in the throne room at the end. It reminds me of the way many of the Oz books would end in the throne room of Queen Ozma. If any of you read them as a child, which I did, and oh my God, that sense of having gone through something and then celebrating it with a full feminine pleasure, just the sheer pleasure at having made it that far, which is such a different thing from the pride and triumph. It's not pride and triumph. It's delivered to a assembled group, a totality, a self is generated. And remember, Princess Leia is very important in that story.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
And that's the anima that is somehow realized, not just capacity.
Right. And so then the question becomes, after you get to the end, and then what? Okay. And that's why one way the Star Wars series has been brilliant, because we see Luke Skywalker later on in some of the later movies, because they went back and had to fill the story. But toward the end, when we get into 8 and 9, we see Luke Skywalker, or 7, 8, and 9 maybe. We see Luke Skywalker on the island as kind of this hermit, cut off from the universe type guy. And I have to wonder whether he successful passed through his midlife crisis.
Well, there you're really almost wondering about Lucas himself and the whole enterprise. The puer eternus, which certainly the eternal boy, which certainly Luke is at the beginning, who is able finally to become an authentic hero and actually get through the hole in the Death Star and actually do something, and is able to do something superb. That settling down and knuckling in and actually getting something done and winning over the anima at that time, that's quite a wonderful first half of life story.
Mm-hmm.
In the second half of life, though, it's less narcissistic in the sense that it's less, the doubtful anima is now, the one who doesn't really believe is now it can fully accept the hero and let him be a hero. That's kind of a wonderful end of first half of life story. But then, as Jung says in the stages of life, you get to the second half of life. And that's when the anima is not just a cheerleader anymore, not just perhaps a difficult, doubting person who then is won over and becomes your cheerleader. That somehow, or even your co-equal partner, that's just the beginning of it. And just as it was just the beginning when Oedipus answered the riddle of the Sphinx. He did not solve the anima problem by answering the riddle of the Sphinx. He opened the door to having to face it. The Iroquois Indians understood this very well, that they understood many things about, for example, men and women. They said, and dreams, they said, well, they're men's dreams and they're women's dreams. Men have their dreams and women have their dreams. And then they explained, though, that, but something funny happens. And this is in Iroquois legend, that after the age of 40, something happens because the men start having the women's dreams and the women start having the men's dreams. And that's when the anima archetypes and the animus archetypes come up. And I think they come up for both sexes. That I think there may be I always say there's kind of a 3-to-1, that maybe the connector to the unconscious and to the self in a man, maybe 3 out of 4 dreams will be a female figure doing that, but there'll be one in which it's a male figure making the connection. And with women, it's often the opposite. It's 3 out of 4 times will be a male figure, but there'll be also a woman figure. So I think it's fair to say that maybe not in quite the same proportion, but men and women both have animus and anima, which ultimately simply mean animus for spirit and anima for soul, spirit and soul, both of those. But in the second half of life, it's amazing how for many men, the anima comes up, and not in a happy form, but Jung says in his writing somewhere, and he takes this from Nietzsche, anima is another word for resentment. Nietzsche made a lot of resentment, and Jung locates that with the anima. So if you see a movie like with an interesting and an ironic title, The Tree of Life, that amazing film that starred Brad Pitt, and if you see The Tree of Life, there you'll see a father who was not promoted and didn't get to where he was going, and then is absolutely, totally resentful and turns that on his son who dies in Vietnam, and on his wife, and finally his other son who becomes the architect in midlife, who's going through the fantasies that you go through in midlife when he tries to figure out how his own anima is constructed. And one of the biggest examples is his father's anima, which was nothing but resentment at not being more successful. And how many men deal with that? I'm sure probably each of us in our different ways dealt with our father's disappointment at not being more than he was.
Surely. So would you concur with me that we need more movies out of Hollywood that deal with the second half of life then?
I couldn't agree more. And when I try to think of those that deal with that, there's a whole way in which we could go into that, but I'm not going to name any right now so much. I mean, I could start to do so, but what I wouldn't be speaking to is the point you just made, is that no matter what you can find, there's a paucity, there's a tremendous lack of, and this gets back to something F. Scott Fitzgerald said, there are no second acts in American lives. and that's really our problem. And I think when I look at the contemporary misery of so many of the people in power, I say, what a failed second act, you know, what a failed second act. What I'm really interested in looking at is people, and I hope we can get the kind of leadership from people who've found it in them to do something with the second half of their life, as opposed to just acting out their resentment. I mean, it's so easy to act out resentment.
Yeah, one of the dangers that I have observed, and this relates to a common bugaboo of military life, is that we have about 22 men a day who are veterans who are committing suicide, and often because of PTSD.
So glad you brought that up, even though it's incredibly painful, because it's right on the point.
Right.
Yes.
And I want to observe that in the films that we currently have and in video games, we've taught our young men to do these electronic boom, boom, boom games and so on, or we've made it look like, geez, you could just zap this thing and there's no consequences, of course, because you never feel the explosion, or it's never you in the theater that's hurt. And so very often I think young men go off to war thinking that it's going to be like a video game. And we come back from battle, and so many men have this thousand yard stare, or dear old dad never talked to me about the war type of thing. And would we be better off in terms of trying to prevent those suicides and PTSD if we were better at training at the beginning the young men about what it's really about? Because when George C. Scott in the movie Patton summed up the archetype that gets constellated, which is when you put your hand in a bunch of goo that a moment before was your best friend's face, you'll know what to do. Okay, so that constellates the warrior, obviously. But then we have no way of detoxing that from anyone, as they did in Roman times. In Roman times, they would keep the legions out of town for a couple of months before they allowed them to go into the city and that sort of thing. But now we don't even think about that. And, George C. Scott again in Patton said that, when the Roman commanders came back and were in their parade after their return, they always had a slave in the chariot with them, whispering, "Remember, all glory is fleeting." And so, I know that PTSD is a very severe issue. I have a very mild form of it, which happens to me only with fireworks and with helicopters going by. And since I live at the Naval Academy, or 2 miles from the Naval Academy, I often have helicopters flying by my house. And, I didn't even know that I had an affliction until after I came back from Vietnam. I was on a boat in the Niagara River to watch the July 4th fireworks. And when the fireworks began, I almost jumped out of the boat. And it was only then that I realized I had an issue. And what I didn't realize, I thought that it would go away, but it never has. And so I've said a lot of things. Your turn to talk.
Well, I'm very moved. And, we all live with something. And I think that's the thing that is so hard to talk about, because there's a stoic persona that we've had at least since Roman times. I think that movie by well, I'll say the name of the movie for a second. And Ridley Scott, Gladiator, is one of the great. I mean, I think that's a remarkable performance by Russell Crowe about the astonishing toll that trying to live up to the heroic expectation and meet the moment and not just be a dominating hero, that's only half of it. The other part, especially for a man, is being a good father. And I'm sure that part of your motivation to be in the service, the word service.
Absolutely.
My motivation to be a doctor, I chose a life of service. I think my job is to serve. And so I had and my heroic aspiration to achieve was certainly pushed by my parents who thought they had a gifted child. They were probably right, but they sure pushed me to very, very high academic achievement. And in a certain sense, they wouldn't tolerate less. And that was its own problem. But my father was in the service, and I think he was also trying to protect his country.
Mm-hmm.
He felt the need to
Assuredly.
do that, and he felt a duty. His own mother had been, like my mother, she, as it just happens in my family on both sides, my grandfathers had abandoned their families, so that both my mother and father grew up with mothers who had to somehow survive that in times when that was pretty difficult, and with limited money. And so, but my grandmother, my father's mother, had excelled amazingly in Greek and Latin, even though she was born in a tiny place called Udall, Kansas, but she was able to keep the family together teaching at the local college in Wichita where they lived. And I met someone when I was in college who came to seek me. She had been his favorite teacher. And he had he told me that she had written something on the board in, if I recall, either in Latin or in Greek, which I think is actually to be found in the New Testament, but she wrote it in the classical language she was teaching, that he was taking. We came here to serve, not to be served. And that, I'm sure, was some part of what motivated my father to be in the service. There was another part, which was the heroic part, that wanted to be the president of the United States and thought the way to get there was to make general. And of course, the great tragedy of my father's life was that he didn't make general, and he only became the president of the local Kiwanis Club. But he told my mother on the first date, I'm going to be president of the United States someday.
Uh-huh.
So that was where he was when they met, and when he was still quite young in many ways. And so that that heroic part was disappointed, but I don't think he was utterly disappointing. I think he was a good battalion commander, and I think he did serve. And I think, thank God, there is a South Korea. I mean, thanks to my father, there is a South Korea among us, and so men like my father. And I couldn't see the father in him because he was so aggressive with the attempt and the kind of failed attempt to be the hero. But there was a father in him. And that
Would
was a good
would
thing
he
to
have been
see.
benefited by being trained in the MBTI? I suspected the later training that I experienced wasn't around when he was coming
Well, we
along.
all create our psychologies to cure our parents of whatever we think their limitations were. So I think he wouldn't have been saved by the MBTI, but my type model would have done the world for him, because it would have shown him the difference between the dominant and the auxiliary function. The big mistake most people make about the auxiliary function is that they think of it as a kind of second motor in case the first motor conks out. So they think of it as, well, I've got this, but I also have that in case this doesn't work. And they think of it as a kind of alter ego. Actually, the auxiliary function is not there to lend aid and support to you. It's there to lend aid and support, like a ladies' auxiliary in the old, my mother was such a person, the gray ladies who would come into hospitals and offer support to the medical team. The auxiliary function is there to lend aid and support to others. So we use the auxiliary function, and this really is my discovery, because nobody else said this before me, that we use the auxiliary function to take care of other people. And it's associated with the archetype of the mother, the archetype of the father, in the broadest psychological sense, as that which fosters, that which protects, and that which secures the possibility for others to thrive. So I'm a doctor, and that's a life of service. My father was an army officer, and that was also in the service. And he saw himself as actually serving a protective function.
Sure.
Now, the father who serves a protective function, I didn't get what that is with my mother complex. And I thought my mother and I were just fine. We didn't need my father at all. And in many ways, he always seemed like an intruder. I didn't get how archetypal and that was until I went to Africa in, I think it was around 2007. And I was in Cape Town, South Africa, and I had just a little bit of time, but I went to the game preserve within 2 hours, a new one where they put in all the big 5 animals. And I was lucky enough to see a family of rhinoceroses. And this is how it happened. We were in this truck. Rhinoceroses can't see very well, but they can hear very well. So you have to be incredibly quiet or they'll charge your Jeep. So we were all in this Jeep. And suddenly we saw this mother rhinoceros and her calf, and they were playing and associating with each other enormously closely. And just as their interplay was wonderful. They looked so happy with themselves, just as I had been with my mother without my father when I was about 10 and 11 years old after their divorce. And at a certain point, a completely other rhinoceros appeared in it, and they were immediately frightened, and even the guy didn't know who that was, and they sort of wondered who was that, because he comes along and he's trying to get near them. They don't want to have anything to do with him. So he just moves away and rather more or less stands guard and is looking right at us, so he can't hear us think, because we're being very quiet. But if he had, he certainly would have dealt with us. It finally dawned on me that was, and then on the guide and everybody, that was the father. Absolutely persona non grata, but without anybody realizing he's doing it, serving the protective function. And he's trying to make sure that those other two are safe. And he's not, as they assumed even, a threat to them. He's the protection of them. So that's sometimes how the auxiliary function works. You're taking care of other people, and they resent your presence, they resent your doing it, and yet without you doing that, just exactly where would they be? I mean, he did make them safer. Had we been in our Jeep the kinds of people that would kill rhinoceroses for profit, he made that harder. Mm-hmm. We weren't those people, but he was there. I think that I saw the whole thing, and that's been going on for hundreds of millions of years before the human race appeared.
Right, right. So there are a number of interesting questions in the group, and one of them sparked one thought that I had. Martin L. has said, sadly, young men look for the warrior in pseudo initiation and join gangs. Do you think that accounts for the gang violence that young Black men find themselves involved in? I think that perhaps it comes down to community for sure, and how young men need to be seen at by the elders of the tribe. I think we have lost the idea of that for various reasons. And I just wanted to mention, um, back at the time, there was an explosion in this nightclub in Paris some years ago, and about 110 people were killed, and many global leaders went to Paris on that occasion. And Anderson Cooper was there, and so he was going around interviewing people. And one of the pair, two men that he interviewed at once were elder Muslim men, and he was in the Muslim part of the Paris suburbs, I think, and he asked them the question, why are these young Muslim men going off to ISIS and to Syria to fight and so on? And one of the answer one of them gave was, well, because they live in this slum and they're poor, and they're not allowed to do much, they have no other way to prove that they are men. And I thought that was a interesting comment. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I was sorry, and perhaps, please forgive me. I mean, we're all human and we all make statements and projections, but I was sorry that the question immediately said that young Black men get involved in. What about white nationalist terrorists?
Yeah, surely.
As supremacists, they're just as much a gang. And what about the three guys that traveled together to make sure that Black man didn't rob any more houses, and they sort of cornered him and shot him and photographed that being done? Aren't they a gang too? In other words,
surely,
men and women travel in packs, as a matter of fact, and they're all over the place. And so we can't. Why we take exception to it in one community without seeing it? It's everywhere. And so what is that adolescent gang that sort of supports each other? Well, that has to do with the tyranny of the stage after the stage of the mother and the father. It comes the peer group in developmental. The developmental sequence is very interesting in the human being. It moves from a stage of positive mother to a stage of negative mother, where after the age of 13 months, there's a biological upsurge in the aggressive drive of a child. And at that point, the child starts testing mother's authority. And so the famous terrible twos come. And then you have a sort of pitched battle between the little boy or girl as trickster and the mother as witch. And so that goes on for a while. And then finally the stage of the father arrives, where the child is now kind of realizes mother is both positive and negative, and the child has developed enough ambivalence to deal with the father, toward whom one is usually ambivalent. And then at a certain point, one goes to school, and then it begins to be the peer group, not the mother or either in a positive or negative aspect, or the father, but with the ambivalence one feels about him and the ambivalence he feels about us, but still trying to take care of us. And then there is the stage of the peer group. And there, I think, problems arise because the peer group gets so powerful, and the group self. This is one of the unsolved problems in Islam, for example, where a group will experience the grand self together with solidity. And if it is not carefully enough led by the imam, then which it can contain it, there is the danger that some kind of inauthentic peer group will take over. I mean, we have to remember that Osama bin Laden arrogated imam properties, but he was not an imam. And sometimes radical groups become a kind of peer group. It's a little bit like Lord of the Rings, where, in a more negative way, and more particularly Lord of the Flies. So Lord of the Rings gives way from a sort of healthy, sweet peer group of people in Middle Earth together to this Lord of the Flies thing where you get a kind of fascist pseudo father in the group. And I think that becomes very, very dangerous. And I would say just about every political movement that we know has that shadow side where there becomes a kind of tyranny. It even takes place in academic life where you get a tyranny of the politically correct, and groupthink makes it impossible for anyone to say anything individually that the group doesn't. So that unacknowledged kind of, we saw that in China during the time, the Cultural Revolution, where there would be this sort of tyranny of the group. And we have this sometimes in academic life today, which is very sad on the left. And I get so sad when I see that kind of, you must think and speak in a specific way, which sort of loses the entire. So people talk about this, and one has to be very careful. Groups are wonderful incubators for consciousness. I've been in many groups in my life. The groups I get involved in are called analytic institutes. And analytic institutes enable people like me to train as Jungian analysts. But psychoanalytic and Jungian analytic institutes have their own group processes that they better look at, because otherwise we get a tyranny. There have been times when people are taught to think exactly like Jung in a Jungian institute, or exactly like Freud. And that isn't what Freud and Jung meant.
Right, right.
And then it's really, really tragic when that happens. And so the tyranny of the group and I think what happens in a group is that it becomes either a pseudo father or a pseudo mother. And very often contrasexual elements come up so that a group of women, one big animus can come up, or a group of men and one big anima can come up. And sometimes those are mean and tyrannical, and they're like a pseudo mother or a pseudo father, through the group. And so you get some crazy ideas. And that, I think, is, we just can't put that on one group of people. We are all guilty of that. All of our cultures have that.
So there's a very appropriate question here, which is from my friend Idris, who says, what are the most important questions we can ask ourselves while writing our own Red Book? Like, what are the 5 main questions we should be asking ourselves?
Well, one is, when did I last ask myself how I know what I know? I like to take a historical method on my certainty. And I try to decide when I developed a particular idea. Because we get all kinds of odd ideas, and they have their own history. In our dream, so our Red Book, my Red Book, would also include writing down my dreams. And when I see a character in a dream who's unknown to me, but let's say the character is 7 years old, I don't immediately assume, aha, that's your developmental stage of being 7 years old, coming back again. What were you like when you were 7 years old, and that kind of thing, and go back into my own developmental history. Rather, I take seriously Jung's idea of the reality of the psyche. And so I say to myself, when I look at a 7-year-old child in my dream, what was born in me 7 years ago? Not what was I like at age 7? No, what was born in me 7 years ago? What idea, attitude, or new instantiation of one of my desires started getting itself into this world and this incarnation 7 years ago? And then I can say, and that's when I got the idea that I'll sometimes find out. And where did that idea come from? And who were its parents? and when I can actually examine my ideas, I can see whether they were good ideas or whether they were changelings. And I think that's one. So I think the first step is, how do I, when did I last decide I knew something? And that's a very useful thing, to take a history on your own ideas, take the history of your own ideas and make sure they have some solid foundation. Many of them do, but many of them don't. So that's one. I think another is, what is my real desire? What do I really want? What is my desire? I mean, Tolstoy took this very seriously. He said, God is the name of our desire. That's a remarkable thing, but you could turn that around and say, whatever we desire most is our God at that particular time. And so we have to ask ourselves who our God is. And that is, what is our desire? And we also then have to ask ourselves, what am I being given? That old song that I like so much. Do you know where you're going to? Do you like what life is showing you? I mean, your red book is your chance to see what life is showing you. I mean, there's things. So, and Salome gave Jung certain gifts. Well, what were the gifts and he did accept her gifts. Among the things, the gifts that she offered him were strongly in the direction of honoring irrational consciousness, gifts of prophecy, things like that. That she helped him realize that it was okay to be an introverted intuitive. She gave him his type. He didn't know his type until Jung was the introvert intuitive function wasn't even discovered by Carl Jung. It was discovered by Maria Moltzer, who was a woman that he was both having an affair with, I'm sorry to say, but also was helping him with his practice in a Dutch woman who was one of the early analysts, and she was the one who proposed the intuitive function as a function of consciousness. Jung didn't realize he was an introverted intuitive, and most of his life he didn't talk as if he realized it then. I realized it, and I think most others do. And what I'm saying is that Salome gave him the right to trust his irrational consciousness, which he didn't have before that. He was trying so hard to make himself a rational thinker. That's why he went to Freud. And that's also why he had to break with Freud, because Freud was too rational to do the job he wanted done. And so that's another thing. So what am I being given? And who don't I like? The Red Book is very revealing, because there's several things Jung doesn't like that are in the Red Book, and they're very revealing of where his shadow really lies. One of them is the extroverted intuitive tramp that likes the movies above all things. And they say Jung is said sometimes to have seen only one movie in his entire life. I actually think he may have seen two, but the movie that he's said to have seen was Mark Connolly's Green Pastures. He does refer to one other movie, but by and large, Jung's attitude towards someone who spends their life at the movies is an attitude of that's just a waste of time. And I think that suggests that Jung didn't have the extroverted intuition that I have, that sees the value in popular entertainment. Jung was a snob in that way and in other ways. And then who's trying to stand up to us and tell us what we don't want to know about ourselves but need to find out? And that's the person that is always sent our way on the path of life. There is always someone who tells us that we're on the wrong track, and usually we try to push that person away. In Jung, there's a chapter in the Red Book called the Red One, in which Jung in this particular imagination is in a tower, and I think that suggests who the I that is called Jung is in that particular active imagination, because this is a tremendously, very tremendously inflated, arrogant snob of an introverted feeling Jung. This is, I think, is his third function, his puer aeternus function, and it's like it's high-minded and idealistic, and the Red One just has some fun with it. In a second, I'll quote a couple of things from this because I think it's some value to our conversation. The way the Red One speaks to Jung's inflated, snobby, introverted feeling is kind of one of the truly wonderful things in the Red Book. And it makes me respect Jung so much that he let this shadow figure, who was nothing else but the devil himself, who I think in Jung's typology was an extroverted feeling trickster, actually speak to him. So here's how the Red One appears. It's a horseman in a red coat, the Red Horseman. He's coming to my castle. He's already riding through the gate. I hear steps on the stairway. The steps creak. He knocks. A strange fear comes over me. There stands the Red One, his long shape wholly shrouded in red. Even his hair is red. I think in the end, he will turn out to be the devil. Well, I think he's definitely the trickster, and I think Jung is the is being compensated for this inflated introverted feeling that was a snob and a mystic, just as Freud noted. The Red One takes this part of Jung on. He asks the Red One who he is, and the Red One says, "Who am I? You think I am the devil. Do not pass judgment. Perhaps you can also talk to me without knowing who I am. What sort of superstitious fellow are you that immediately you think of the devil?" So he just takes Jung on. And with that immediate knowing, and so eventually they keep on talking, and Jung is intrigued yet puzzled. And as their conversation develops, it takes on, as I say in my book, the quality of verbal sparring. And at a certain point, Jung seems to feel paradoxically that he's established enough trust with the figure to express his distrust openly. And he says, "You sound cool and sneering. Have you never broken your heart over the holiest mysteries of our Christian religion?" And there is Jung's spiritual inflation, and that's so common in the Eternal Boy. And Jung sounds so precious and appears to take his Christianity so very seriously. And the trickster is the devil says, "Your solemnity smells of fanaticism. You have an ethical air and a simplicity that smacks of stale bread and water." And Jung, at a certain point, says something about Jews not having accepted the passion of Jesus and therefore not knowing enough about suffering, for goodness sake. And the red one says, you know, you sound anti-Semitic. And Jung has to hear the degree to which his spiritual snobbery has actually made him uncompassionate. So that makes me feel so much better about Jung. That already between 1913 and 1914, he was going to get hell for an attitude that got him in trouble, which I do not think was political or everyday ethnic anti-Semitism of the kind of, not social snobbery, but it was a true religious snobbery that his version of spirituality had to be top dog. And that there was something missing in people who didn't get it. And there was the inflation of a minister's son who thought that in his, and Jung certainly had a lot of understanding of religion and a lot of correct understanding of the psychological value of Jesus's teaching, but that snobbery. But the lovely thing is he let the devil work on him. And so he wrote himself in the Red Book, through my coming to terms with the devil, he accepted some of my seriousness and I accepted some of his joy. It is always a risky thing to accept joy, but it leads us to life and its disappointments, from which the wholeness of our life becomes. So it was a step toward receiving the anima. So my friend and very good friend, my colleague Tom Kirsch, describes how when he met Jung in person, and of course his parents were Jewish, Tom was Jewish, and he was received by Jung because he was the son of Jungian analysts. And Tom met him around the time he was 19 years old. So it was in the middle 50s. And Jung gave him a handshake, and he said it was the warmest handshake he had ever experienced in life. And the later Jung was someone who had integrated the extroverted feeling of the red one, which was against that terribly inflated, snobby, judgmental, introverted feeling, which has offended just about everybody sooner or later in encountering Jung. It put all these kinds of things happen when you do your red book. You have to find your shadow figures and you have to let them teach you and tell you what they think of you. It's not enough that you don't like them. They don't like you either. And you have to hear from them. And that is the greatest thing that happens to us. That's how we get analyzed. And we're all very one-sided and imperfect, and especially in that third function, which is like the troubling corner. That's where the narcissism lies. And if you can accept the shadow, the rest of your individuation can proceed. That's the one where the red book really makes a difference.
John, you've been very generous with your time. There's a couple of more questions here.
Go ahead with them, and then we'll have to take two and then go.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I appreciate it very much. That was
one of them, Nancy has asked, and I want to dovetail it with something else that I'm observing right now. And it's the trope about Jung in Germany in the early 1930s. And Nancy asked this question: was Hitler's Germany experiencing the self together, quote unquote? But I found on Chiron Publications recently, because I'm now reading it, the play that was created by Murray Stein and another analyst named Abramowitz from Israel, which is about, it's called The Analyst and the Rabbi. And it, in active imagination form tries to recreate the exchange between Jung and Beebe, which occurred in October of 1946. By coincidence, that happens to be the month I was born.
They were staying at the same hotel by chance, and Jung, knowing who he was,
right.
Wanted to talk. Jung sought Leo Baeck, who was the rabbi of Berlin, extraordinary figure. And all we know is very little of what was said later about their conversation. It went on for some time, so we have most of the conversation one can only imagine because we don't have what actually got said.
Right. So this is Mary Stein and Dr. Abramovitz imagining what happened, but
it's Abramovich, Henry Abramovich. He's a lovely guy.
Okay. Yeah.
Teaches a lot in outside of Jerusalem. He goes to Russia a lot. Has been very influential in the development of Russian analytical psychology as well.
Right. Okay. So when I started doing this 4 years ago, one of the first things that came up was one of my students, who happened also to be a psychotherapist, came to me and said, well, Dr. Jung was a Nazi sympathizer. And I've never really believed that. I mean, I certainly know of the accusation that has been used to keep Jung down, I think, but because of so many Jews that were in his circle over the years, right from the beginning, and including the so-called Valkyries and so on, and the fact that, okay, he was caught in a situation in the early 1930s where he was the president of the International Association. But do you want to address that issue in any way? And you can say
I'd
no.
be happy to. Well, there's no evidence whatsoever that Jung was a Nazi sympathizer in the way that, for example, Heidegger was, to choose another person whom, oddly enough, the academia has, thanks mainly to his student and one-time mistress, Hannah Arendt, who was Jewish. He stayed important, Heidegger, in academic philosophy, not only because of the excellence of some of his philosophical writings. Jung just absolutely loathed Heidegger, and I'm not enormously impressed with Heidegger myself, but he has a respectable place in philosophy for various reasons. But there was a man who actually was a member of the Nazi Party and actually went along, when he was the rector of a university, in having dismissed Edmund Husserl, who had been his teacher, the great phenomenologist, who was the basic pre-philosophy to what became known as existential philosophy through Heidegger and in France, Sartre, and and many others. But there we have Heidegger, who actually went along when he was rector of the university with Husserl losing his university post and therefore his income, his livelihood, everything, simply because he was Jewish. There is absolutely no political behavior of that type with Jung. And in fact, it's the opposite, because when he inherited the presidency, just because he happened to be vice president of the German Medical Society for Psychotherapy, and Hitler came to power at almost exactly the same time, he worked hard to make sure that Jewish members were not unable to practice under the umbrella of a psychotherapy organization by creating an international medical society for psychotherapy. That, by the way, still exists under another name, but that organization still exists. And the Jewish members who could not any longer belong to the German society could still belong to the International Society. And he did that so that they could continue to practice and have colleagues. And he took over the journal and he published Jewish authors in the journal.
Right.
Now,
Yeah.
that did not stop him from making some very poorly judged conciliatory statements in which he would somehow accept that there are some differences between Jewish psychology and the rest of psychology, and that he would, this journal would now make room for these differences or something like that, which in the effort to create let me put it this way, Carl Jung was no Henry Clay. And what he was trying was a Missouri Compromise, and what he ended up was just a compromise of his own integrity, and it was a disgraceful thing. And he also went to Berlin Radio in 1933 and said, well, the hour of the Führer has come, the hour of the leader, and so, you know, the bleeding of parliaments is over, and, you know, unbelievable junk. But he did say, but then he added, but if the Führer doesn't know himself, that's going to be a problem. So if you take certain statements Jung made in 1933 and 1934, you could walk away and say that this man is a Nazi sympathizer and anti-Semite. It's not as simple as that. And if you look closely and really look at what he said, I'm not a bit proud of it, but politically he was not taking an anti-Semitic posture. And he personally did a lot of work to help Jewish people, and several of them who came to Switzerland were treated incredibly kindly by him. And as Anelia Yaffe said, he chose a Jewish woman to write his autobiography. This is not anti-Semitic.
Right.
And he had been incredibly kind to her, gave her work. She had been trained as a psychiatrist. In a medical doctor. She couldn't work because of what happened. She became his secretary. And when he saw that she needed a vacation, he said, you need to stay at a nice hotel and get some good food. And he paid for all that. And she, you know, he was very, very kind to her. And he gave her a lot of, so the answer is, the spiritual snob is there, the person who thinks Christianity somehow knows more than Jewish people about suffering. And he didn't get over that until after he saw what happened in World War II. But on balance, that's not the problem. That it is not, his problem was he didn't listen to what he learned in his own red book, that he should never have gone back into a place of heroic political power. He should never have tried to play the hero. He wasn't suited for it. And so one of the things he said to Leo Baeck, but it cannot be the only thing, was I slipped up.
Yeah.
And he did. He slipped up on his own power complex, as a matter of fact, that he wanted to be the wisest man in the world. And like that joke, you know, the smartest man in the world just jumped out of the plane and with my backpack, father. You know, that, I mean, in other words, that's what Jung did. And, you know, that's what happens when you act like the smartest man in the room. Sometimes the analyst just has to keep his mouth shut. And, but, you know, by 1940, Jung is calling Hitler the Antichrist, and he's helping the OSS against Hitler. That's all on record. So he was not what people say, but he was also not everything I would have wanted him to be.
We need to take one more question or comment from Louis LaFontaine, who is here. And go ahead, Louis.
On the subject of Dr. Jung and his purported support of Nazis and his anti-Semitism, it should be noted that when he was in Berlin at one time, he was nearly arrested by the Gestapo. Later on, he was marked for death by the Gestapo. He helped innumerable Jews find refuge either in Switzerland or in England. During the war, he and a small group of individuals, particularly one German psychiatrist who was close to Nazi leadership, tried to organize a group that would negotiate peace between Germany and the Allies. That subsequently failed. And it should be noted that at the end of his life, in his will, he bequeathed his literary estate to 4 different people. One person was his daughter, Mary Ann. The other 3 individuals were all Jews. So this is hardly deeds that would be done by a Nazi sympathizer or an anti-Semite. It should also be noted that it was long said that his heir apparent before his untimely death was Eric Newman.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so that is really a canard.
Yeah.
I posted on the chat feature a list of a number of quotations from Dr. Jung about Nazis, the Gestapo, so that people can go to a first-hand source of his views. And that's my comment.
Right.
To which I thank you so much. And I would advise anyone who wants to study this as objectively as possible to find and obtain, it's worth the $40 it costs in hardcover, unfortunately, but if you can hear the title, it's Jung's Evolving Views of Nazi Germany, from the Nazi takeover to the end of World War II. And this is William Schonel, Schoenl, and Linda Schonel, Schonel, I think that's his wife. The 2 of them wrote this book together. It's by far the best we have in one volume that tells the entire story. But Jungians have given a lot of attention to this. There's the book Lingering Shadows, was the original title, edited by Arya, A-R-Y-E-H, Maidenbaum. There's quite an interesting literature on this. But there were some very ugly things that did happen in the Jungian world that we have, as a Jungian group, we've had to take responsibility for. And one of them was that in 1945, the committee, there was a committee that met of the Analytical Psychology Club that Jung had founded, but was at that was the year that he had had his heart attack, and he was not active in it, not active in this decision, but they made a decision to impose a quota on no more than something like 10% members of the group could be Jews. And the feeling on the part of the Analytical Psychology Club, like of many other clubs in the world, was too many Jews was too many. And it was particularly because so many Jews were coming in from so that became a stain. And I myself happened to be at the place where that was discussed. It was created by my colleague who in 1989 had got us all to face this issue in a group at our Congress that we had of Jungians in Paris, and Jerry Bernstein headed that panel. And I stood up and I said, why can't we ask the Analytical Psychology Club for an apology? And So people were interested in that idea. Jerry took it up. Some thought, what do you mean ask for an apology? But he took it up and he valiantly and spent quite a lot of time getting the leadership of the Living Still in the Analytical Psychology Club to deal with this issue. And at first, they really didn't want to deal with it. They said, well, I can't apologize for what I didn't do. That was in the past, this and that. And he had to report at first, nobody wanted to face it. But eventually, thanks to Jerry's personal and strong efforts, at another Jungian meeting, talking about having struck out at first, there in the room was a woman named Jane Reed, who was a member of the Analytical Psychology Club. She took it back to the club and they agreed to do an investigation. It turned out that in 1936, when Jung was present in the Analytical Psychology Club, the issue of a quota was raised, and Jung stood up and said, if people are experiencing an influence that they find difficult from people of another group, they should look for that influence within themselves rather than in that group. So he stood up and spoke against the quota being, now it was imposed in 1945 when he was not part of the political group that did. But in 1950, when there were still 2 Jewish members who were associate members, and they were about to bring in another member, Jung stood up and said, if you do not make these people full members of the club, I am going to leave this club. So at that point, the quota was dropped. So the 2 times Jung was present to actually speak about it, he went on the other side, not on the side of the quota. So the fact that it occurred at all and that he didn't immediately deal with it in 1945 is a historical fact. But again, it weighs against this idea, Jung the anti-Semite, Jung the Nazi sympathizer. And that has also been Jay Cox, who examined the entire development of psychotherapy in Germany under the Nazis, also comes to essentially the same conclusion. So it's a painful subject, but as you just said, history actually supports that Jung, that what you're saying is a canard. It remains that there was a problem within some of the Jungian group that Jung had to finally deal with definitively, and thank heaven he did. So I hope that gives you a full enough account.
John, thank you so much for being patient with us and going for so long.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
Sorry, because it's
right.
closely related to this one. Because I don't know if you're aware, right now there's in California and other state, Washington State, in Seattle, there were big debate about the quota for college, because I think the Chinese or Asian, they're facing exactly what happened to Jewish, because, they are working very hard academically and they were punished by that because there are too many Asians in the school, and they have to, proportionally based on the race to admit school. I think you can change your priority, but I don't think race could be the factor, to limit kids to go into college, which is just like discrimination of any kind, right? It just
certainly no one has ever said in American universities that there are too many whites and there are too many Protestants. So I think
I know.
Look, my whole life has been about making bridges to people, and the only way this goes away is when we get to know each other. When we talk about the Jews or the Chinese, or for that matter, the Jungians, it sounds despicable. It's a little bit like when people were talking for a long time, people kept asking, can't we have gay marriage? And people resisted. And I can see why they did, because you don't have gay marriage any more than you have blue marriage or heliotrope marriage or pink marriage. But when they started talking about marriage equality, I mean, look, we're just all people. And we all have some color. You know, E.M. Forster did it so beautifully in A Passage to India. Well, you know, the white races are not really white. They're really pinko gray. And so who do we think we are? I mean, white supremacy is a horrible thing, and American exceptionalism is a horrible thing. When I was a child, I'll just stop with this, but when I was a child of 9, I was a lonely child. I was an only child. I was living in Nanking, China for between 8 to 10. My father was the assistant military attaché in what was then called Nanking before the revolution. And I used to have a fantasy. First of all, it was sort of cold in the old house that we lived in. And so I would love to have the covers over me, and we had a merchant's home, and we had a staff of 7 servants. And so I had this, you know, we were living like kings, but I had this blanket over me and my big bed. And I would have the fantasy, wouldn't it be wonderful if my bedspread would really spread and it would somehow go all over the world so that I could, and that it would be linked to every other bed in the world, so that I would never have to get out from under my cover, and I could just go from bed to bed all around the world. And that's exactly what I do now. I consult with people all over the world. And my father said long ago, he said, I've discovered that people are pretty much the same everywhere. And I have to say, I've analyzed in every part of this world. And I must tell you, it's the same old story. So it's absolutely ridiculous that we would start setting up quotas of anybody. The university should be lucky that people are good enough to study in them wherever they come from and beyond. And that means we should be glad to have analysts. And I find Jungian analysis really works everywhere. People dream everywhere, and they benefit from studying their dreams. So to me, the Jungian is my bedspread. And that's how I look at it.
Yeah. That's a wonderful comment, John, to end on. And I think I may later make a shorter video just of these last few minutes where you've been discussing this issue, because it's a common trope that I hear, and you've answered it extremely well.
Skip?
Yes.
My last comment would be to mention one profile in courage in the Jungian world, and that is James Kirsch, who was born in Guatemala. He was Jewish.
Yes.
He ended up living in Palestine before Palestine became Israel.
Yes.
And around the time that he was living in Palestine, these allegations about Dr. Jung's anti-Semitism and Nazi support began to surface. He took a marvelous step, and he wrote an open letter to the Palestinian people. And by that, I mean Jews and Palestinians living within what was then the country of Palestine, defending Dr. Jung. And that took a great deal of courage at that time, because many people then, and as they do today, blindly believe allegations without actually researching the facts. So I've always admired him for the personal courage that he had. And he was a lifelong friend of Dr. Jung's. And I would also mention a man named Ernest Harms.
Yes.
Wrote a book entitled C.G. Jung, Defender of the Jews.
Yes.
It's very short, but
it's an article in the Psychiatric Quarterly that it was published. It's a very good article.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But
Okay,
yes, James Kirsch, I knew him personally, and he was the father of Tom Kirsch, who I mentioned earlier, who met Jung when he was 19 and got that warm handshake. And Tom's mother was Hilda Kirsch, and yes, Hilda and James were both in Palestine, and that was a very important, as was
and they went on to be very influential in the United States.
Yes.
A little bit in New York City, but primarily in California and the C.G. Jung Institute in Los Angeles. Hilda Kirsch, I could be wrong in this, but I think the library was named after her there. But I could be wrong, but they were very influential.
Yeah, I think maybe the Children's Center, but she was a very important, and I knew them both. And in fact, I went over and talked to them immediately after becoming certified as a Jungian analyst in 1978 in Los Angeles. And Hilda was absolutely affirming, and James was absolutely contentious. They were a very wonderful couple.
John, do you have a particular symbol that you would like me to use as the thumbnail on this particular video, which is going to be on playback shortly on YouTube? And just for your information, we've had about 30 people watching this so far. Not all of them on the Zoom, but also on YouTube. And we're certainly extremely appreciative for your time and talking to us today, very much so. But do you have a particular book cover or something you'd like me to use as a?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't mind, if you wouldn't mind, using the cover image of, let's see if I can find a good copy where I can show this to you. Just a second.
I probably can take it off of
I think the
Amazon.
cover image of my book, Integrity in Depth, which was supplied to me by the sinologist, that is professor of Chinese studies, wonderful man, Victor Mayer, M-A-I-R, at the University of Pennsylvania, who's done so much for Chinese studies.
Could you hold it up a little higher? Because
it's the figure of,
yes. Wonderful.
of what is called in Chinese de, which is often spelled te but pronounced de. In fact, in the current opinion, it's de. It's the same term that you find in the Tao Te Ching, which is by Lao Tzu, and the word de is usually translated virtue, but in the earliest period, a better translation would be what we nowadays call integrity. The term de actually went across the Silk Route and ended up in, Victor Mayer established this in the West, and in the English language, we have it in the word doughty, D-O-U-G-H-T-Y. So I'm not going to claim that I have integrity, but as John Beebe is doughty, I will say he's at least that, D-O-U-G-H-T-Y. And if he is, it's because he's taken the idea of de seriously. Now, the de is, it means this to the Chinese. You can see this pictogram. It's earlier than present day calligraphy, but what it shows is over on the left-hand side is a man walking, or a person walking. Now below you can see the image of what is really a heart. And above it is an eye, but that eye has a line above it, and the line above it means that the eye is looking outward, which means a certain objectivity, a willingness to face outward and try to discern what's going on there. So I see integrity as combining these three things, and they involve walking in accord with what the heart feels and the eye sees, looking at the situation as objectively as possible.
Terrific.
And when you combine those three things, where you walk the walk And you are in touch with what you feel, but you're also checking what you feel about what you see and can verify outside yourself. That's what I mean by integrity. And I think Jungian analysis at its best fosters that. At its worst, you just walk, but you don't do the other two things, or you just have what your heart feels and you forget to look and discern, or you see, but you don't look outward. You just see. And when you don't do all three, you get in trouble. When you do all three, an amazing thing happens. You may actually get in Tao, or get closer to the Tao, which is the goal, the Tao being a kind of flow of life, to come back to where you were at the beginning, because the Tao is just the way of life, and it is a way that is flowing, but you stay relevant and you stay in the game. That's what Jung was really interested in. Yeah. And so he didn't get it all right, but he sure gave us the basis for doing that. And of course, he loved Lao Tzu. So if I want to be remembered for anything, it's like that.
Thank you so much. I'll certainly do that. and I'll definitely put links to that book and the book name, and cover some of the issues that you've raised there. So thank you so much for being with us today. We really
You've made this virtual meeting a reality. We're making eye contact now, and
yes, sir.
We're connected. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for being a part of it. And we have a tradition at the end of these sessions to use a Sanskrit mantra
nice.
that doesn't offend most religions, and it's a mantra about the happiness of the world and the happiness of all the worlds. And so if you'll give me a moment, I'll share that with you. Om Loka Samasa Sukhino Bhavantu Loka Samasa Sukhino Bhavantu Loka Samasa Sukhino Bhavantu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. With apologies to my friend Kushbu, who taught that to me. We'll leave you with that message. Thank you so much again.